What we will be doing today is introducing the idea of a Victoria 3 mechanic that we will call freight. The intention of freight is to rework how the cost of transporting goods is dealt with, which is currently abstracted as a combination of infrastructure, convoys, and transportation, and do this by introducing a consumable good called freight that we hope will promote trade, specialization, exploitation and extraction of less fortunate nations by industrialized ones, reward maritime focus in game, and also creating a sprawling effect from major economic centers around which economies will develop. In addition, we also hope to address several ahistoric and counterintuitive issues that are created with the current system regarding the movement of goods. While it is beyond the scope of this video, these changes are intended within the context of several other changes that may be topics for other videos, including a decoupling of industrialization from research technology, reworking the military-navy system, which would include sinkable ships and stockpiles, and reworking the diplomatic play by introducing the idea of diplomatic pressure, requests, demands, and escalations. These ideas may be referenced as they relate to freight, but they won't be fully expanded upon. We will start by explaining some of the problems with the current system and offer up examples that are used to highlight some of these problems. Then we will discuss how freight is used and its various sources. And finally, we will discuss some of the additional effects created by freight or proposed to be created by freight, and hopefully some of the emergent systems that will be created by such a mechanic. The first up is trade and specialization. Now, this is something I've talked extensively about in another video, which I will link down below, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to kind of briefly describe how the current system basically stifles trade to a standstill and doesn't really allow for specialization, which is kind of the basis of trade. And this is also something that is an essential feature during the Victorian era, was the exploitation of, more resource-oriented economies by the industrialized economies by using asymmetric trade, where they would extract the raw resources and export finished goods, and in effect force an extraction of value that doesn't really happen in Victoria 3. Instead, there's just like some trade, and the fact that you're buying worse goods and building better goods yourself is kind of the payoff, and it doesn't really capture the important element of exploitation. The first issue with trade is the many ways in which Convoys, as a mechanic, punishes naval and maritime, distribution of goods and rewards land distribution of goods in a way that's not really historic. And kind of the two examples that we're going to come back to repeatedly are going to be comparing and contrasting Great Britain, which historically speaking was an absolute leader in the shipping of goods and the moving of goods as a result of its enormous naval presence, and Russia, who historically had an enormous amount of trouble, one of the problems being that these ports, they freeze over, and yet in game, as we see, Great Britain is actually the worst off in terms of convoy shipment problems, and Russia is actually in the best position out of any power in the game, and this doesn't really make a lot of sense. So in order to kind of unpack this, we need to talk about the port connections mechanic. First of all, the port connections are paid for entirely by the government. The government purchases convoys, and convoys are used to maintain port connections. This in itself is already ahistoric, as a lot of the shipping was done by private enterprise, and the British government just facilitated it by providing, safe shipping lanes and stuff like this. The private industry themselves were the ones who supplied it. Now, this has to be the case with the current system of convoys, because the output good of convoys is just a government kind of mana type of thing, rather than being a good in itself. And since it's not a good that's selling for anything, this building can never be profitable, which means it can never be under private enterprise. By introducing freight as a good, we create a system where these can be privately owned and run, which is far more historic. Second, and this is really the crux of the issue, is that port connections, if done by land, are completely free, and if done by sea, end up costing you an enormous amount of convoys, and this makes any sort of government or empire, which is primarily connected by the sea, way, way, way more expensive to manage in terms of convoys, and this is ahistoric to the time period where the cheapest way to ship goods very often was shipping it by sea. Instead, we have a system where shipping things by land effectively is very, very cheap. And what I mean by this, if we look at the port connections here, we have around 8.5k convoys. We are using 3,000 for port connections. This is primarily connecting to the EIC. 50-ish years into the game, this will become very, very expensive for Great Britain, and it will lead to that occupying 80-90% of the total convoys that they have, which completely takes away from trade routes, and you can't run very many trade routes. Contrast this with, for example, Russia, where we connect everything by land. If Russia were to gain control of the EIC and also gain control of a few Central Asian, kind of powers in their market, the convoy cost of that would be absolutely free. In terms of a historical kind of thing or a practical thing, Russia would never ever ship goods overland through these mountainous terrain, through several hundred miles of, kind of expanse, and then get to St. Petersburg and have that be cheaper than shipping it by sea. But that is exactly what we see. Another really good indicator is that, kind of Alaska is very, very far away from St. Petersburg. But Alaska can ship goods to St. Petersburg and only has to travel through 3 sea nodes to do so because it connects over here to Siberia, and then from Siberia it ships the good to St. Petersburg. There's currently, for the purposes of port connections, which is how the government is paying for all the goods as far as they're transported across their nation, it does not capture the very real cost that it would be involved if we were to just try and ship goods from Ob to St. Petersburg. Instead of this having any sort of abstracted cost, this is absolutely free. 100% free. And this system is one that rewards you for weird types of play patterns, like specifically trying to draw a land bridge so that you don't have to pay convoy costs on anything. Instead, what is needed is a system that cares about the distance to St. Petersburg, regardless of how it is, drawn up. So if we need to go through 8 provinces, that should be more expensive than going through 3 provinces, and that's what we're hoping that freight will achieve. Moreover, convoys are really expensive, and throughout the game, as the game goes later and later, a smaller and smaller proportion of your total trade routes kind of payments will be done by convoys, and instead a larger and larger portion of your trades will be done with free trades or convoyless cost trades, wherein you have a land border with the market that you're trading with, and you don't have to pay any convoys here. This further rewards you for having land connections in a way that's not very historic, because if we were to ship to Austria, we probably would do it by a combination of sea and rail, but it also discourages specialization, because what this ends up happening is every single thing that you could possibly want to export, you want to export to as many people as possible with the free trade routes, and you cannot specialize really hard in one thing because the free trade routes have a kind of max level, and it creates this weird sort of situation where it's better to just generalize in goods, and every type of market looks homogeneous and similar, because we are just trying to pursue as many free levels of trade as possible, which doesn't, again, make a lot of sense. That there should be some types of trade that are free, and it's not a total level of free trade routes, but instead it is a free trade routes level per good rather than per market or per country. Another way in which trade profitability is significantly decreased is through MAPI or market access price impact. Where you experience the value for trade is at the margins of things happening, and without going into too much detail on how it works, market access price impact eats into the margins such that it very, very significantly decreases the profitability of trade. What we need is a system that allows MAPI or market access to be a lot more fluid and allow us to have certain centers of trade where MAPI is going to be very high, and also have a mechanic for forcing other countries to have higher MAPI by shipping them freight, and then with that freight, shove more goods down their throat. that is an ideal kind of situation which would properly reflect kind of the exploitative nature of the Victorian era, where we would force ship them goods in order to devolve their economies from being industrialized themselves, and instead just import from them an extractive type of model. But the current system for MAPI, what this does is it creates a system that just rewards every single economy for building the same kind of like homogenized market that looks the same, because trade is not very effective. There's no way to weaponize trade because MAPI is effectively a defensive barrier that prevents you from forcing goods in or out of markets. And so what we need is a system that either allows you to penetrate through the shield of MAPI or to weaponize it against other countries. Now, there is another MAPI-related issue that will not be solved by freight, and it is something that people have complained about in regards to the distribution of good. The way that freight is going to work is it's going to track distance to the trade capital or the market center, or possibly a market hub. We'll unpack that more later. Depending on how global versus local you want the system to be, you would allow for multiple market hubs, not just connecting to the market capital. But what it's doing is it's tracking distance to either a market hub or a market capital, and so it will be, in order for Diyarbakir, for example, to connect, it's going to have to go through 1, 2, 3 land provinces, or it would have to go through 1 sea province, and so, or sorry, 1 land province and then 1 sea province. With that said, there is a problem here in that if we were to construct steel in Diyarbakir and we wanted to source iron, it would make a lot of sense for us to source it from Erzurum and pay even less and only have to travel a distance of 1. My understanding is that from the perspective of performance, this is completely an impossible prospect to track every single good, where it's being built, and where it's getting consumed. Instead, what the freight system aims to do is to track these sorts of distances not by a by good basis, but by a by state basis, with several modifiers to allow different states to pay different types of proportions and ratios for freight in a way that makes more sense. And so for here, we would not be able to achieve the goal of shipping to Erzurum from Diyarbakir, but we would be able to ship both, kind of paying distance to connect to the market capital. As far as I know, there is not a performance, viable solution to allow for the tracking of all the goods. But what I hope is that freight is performance friendly enough that it will allow us to still think about distance in a way that is not completely divorced from the system, as it is now, where distance is kind of irrelevant because us shipping from, Basara to the capital is exactly the same cost as us shipping from northern Thrace to the capital here, or the market capital here in Constantinia. So I think this next point would benefit a lot from a visualization, and so we're going to take a look at the heat map of the United States, and the thing we're going to talk about is that the way that economies and also, migration expand is not in this sort of way where everyone can move everywhere all at once, which is what we currently experience in Victoria 3 as it relates to the United States. The internal and central states get enormous amounts of migration pull, and at the same time, there is not anywhere near as much population density on the coasts as there was historically speaking. The reason for this is migration attraction is not in any way modified by the existence of, transportation available in order to get people there or get the goods to people that are choosing to settle in different areas, and instead we have this system where everyone migrates everywhere. If you take a look at this heat map during westward expansion, where people are namely moving westward, the migration activity radiates outwards from centers where there is a lot of infrastructure and ability to move populations as well as goods. The system needs to properly reflect this, and the way that we're going to do it, because we might as well talk about it here rather than, a little bit later, is that what we need is a system that is going to, when freight costs are really expensive, this will discourage migration, and when freight costs are incredibly cheap, and this is on a per state basis we're thinking of this will encourage migration. And by doing it in this way, we can have, economic and population centers radiate outwards from areas that have enormous amounts of freight, areas like New York and the, kind of northeast coast of the United States, whereas these places just kind of in the middle of nowhere, looking at you, Montana, will experience very, very little migration as it relates to, kind of the time period of the game, which we see kind of a bit of a historical precedent here. And so by introducing freight as a mechanic that will influence migration, we can do this. And so what I was thinking is that you will just add the cost, or rather subtract the cost of freight, what the freight cost is from migration attraction. 1 plus this will be the number that you get. And so what you will do is, if you are at minus 75% freight, you will have 175% migration attraction. And if you're at plus 75 freight cost, you will have 25% migration attraction. Or rather than attraction, perhaps have it be the quotas, or the maximum amount of migration possible. And in this way, you can get a system where population movements will look a little bit more like they do in this video here. We will talk about this a little bit more later, but I just kind of wanted to point this out close to the start because this can be on people's minds as they go through some of the ideas, which is that I think freight can replace 3 different mechanics currently. I think it only needs to absolutely replace one. The 3 mechanics that it can replace is, I think it has to replace convoys. I think the convoy system can be out. I don't have any problem with, instead of calling it freight, just calling it convoys instead, and it to mechanically change convoys. I have no problem with this, but I don't think the convoy system is compatible. The second is transportation. You can think of transportation as freight, and so you can think of it in this way, but you could also think of transportation instead as local freight or land-based freight, and kind of modify it around that, whereas there is a more globalized freight available, and in this way you could try and balance freight or think things through in this way. We will talk about this. And the third system I think that could get replaced, would perhaps be a little bit strange to replace it, is infrastructure. I think that if you have a certain amount of freight, you could say that the freight gives you infrastructure, this type of thing, and you could look at it as something that needs to be consumed in order to provide infrastructure, let's say, perhaps in the urban centers, although that would be a little bit strange. We'll come back to that. But this is another system that if you wanted to change it or incorporate it or remove it as a result of deciding to incorporate freight, I think that you could do this. So we will start with the buy orders that are created for freight, because I think this is the kind of the crux of unpacking the thing. Specifically, every single industry that is not in the market capital, in this case the home counties, and is also not a subsistence farm, every single one of these will have a new input required, which is going to be in the form of freight. And this will represent the cost of bringing the good to the market. And this will scale in 3 different ways simultaneously, which I'm hoping is what really creates the emergent patterns. Each one of these ways of scaling is going to create different sorts of patterns, and them all layered on top of each other will create what I think is a good representation of the cost of moving goods around a nation or an empire. Now, the first one is kind of the most straightforward, and that is the distance you have to travel. So if you have to travel, 2 provinces, in this case, Lancashire has to travel 2 provinces, 1, 2, whereas Midlands would only have to travel 1. This will decrease the cost or increase the cost as you move further and further and further away. This means that your economies will look a particular way if they are far away than they would if they look closer. But very importantly, kind of referring back to this USA example, this will create the radiating sort of effect where your kind of market centers will attract the most people and economic activity. As economic activity, as you move further and further away from the market capital, will generally get less efficient as it will accrue an increasing level of freight cost. Now, moving stuff by sea through sea nodes and moving stuff by land is going to vary depending on modifiers and buildings you have. For example, we'll talk about it more, but if you have a lot of railroads, then moving stuff by land will get a decreased cost, or this will decrease the cost of moving stuff by land. And in general, moving stuff by sea will have to travel through fewer nodes, and you could also make these nodes cheaper to travel through. This is something you could adjust as you want. It also would make sense for this to be logarithmic rather than linear, and so it could be the case that you want to travel through two provinces instead of being a 200% cost, be like a 180% cost, and traveling through three provinces to be like a 250% cost, where the marginal cost of one additional province or state rather goes down and down and down in order to make the effects such that like places that are kind of far from the capital don't incur anywhere near as big as a negative effect by having to pay the extra freight, making the industry less profitable. The second modifier is the weight of the output good that is getting produced, which you can think of in a bunch of different ways. The most literal interpretation would be calculating the actual physical weight per square meter of the good and scaling it in a way that is linear with this. I don't think that that's necessarily appropriate for a game, although it would be the best simulation. I think the way to create the most interesting emergent gameplay patterns wherein industrialized nations with a very heavy freight advantage are able to force their industrialized goods down the throat of unindustrialized countries. I think the system that would be most interesting for that would be the heavier the good, generally speaking, the more construction cost the good is, so the 800 construction cost buildings, or the higher tier the industrial good, the more expensive the freight is going to be for that good. This also scales pretty linearly with the total costs of the output and the input combined of the good, and you could do it in this way too. But by doing it like this, countries that have really cheap freight will get an enormous advantage in the export of, or in the production of stuff like steel and engines. Countries with very, very expensive freight will have an advantage instead with resources and agriculture, although iron is physically heavy, and so from a simulation perspective, it maybe doesn't make sense that iron is cheap to transport, but in terms of looking at the economies in a bit of an extractive way, to be fair, iron was actually also not transported quite as much. But if you look at it in an extractive way, if these other countries have expensive freight and they are more economically incentivized to create agriculture, we create a sort of feedback loop, and we will talk about this more later, but this is what would enable exploitation and create systems where trade would be asymmetric, and it would introduce this specializing asymmetry that is not tied to a country, but is instead tied to what a country has an advantage in, which freight would add a sort of force multiplier to specifically industrial goods. I also generally think industrial PMs like steel should be buffed, and if this were the case, you would get more of a payout for going for freight, because going for freight would allow you to specialize in steel and dump steel to other countries, and by dumping it to other countries, you would force them onto being more resource-oriented and hurt their ability to industrialize. I also think industrialization should not be tied to technology, but that's like too much to unpack here. The third variable is kind of the most complicated and is one where I think it might introduce calculations that make the game run a little bit slower, and so this one is a little bit tentative, but it is the idea that if you have states whose local prices very much resemble the market price, then that means that they're creating all this stuff locally and consuming all this stuff locally, and so this means that they shouldn't have to pay freight either to send their goods to market or to bring in particular imports for their own consumption. This doesn't make sense, and so their freight costs should be approaching zero in this instance. And so what this modifier will mean is that what we will do is we will take the prices, we will look at the prices and and how much they deviate from the market price. You can see this one costs minus 27% relative to the market. We will multiply it by the total amount of goods that are getting moved in this way. I don't know if we want to do the buy orders plus the sell orders, just the buy orders, just the sell orders, what exactly we are doing here. There's definitely a bunch of different ways you can approach it, but the idea is a greater proportion of the goods that have a smaller deviation from the market, the less we will have to pay for freight. And I think that this will reward a lot of emergent kind of gameplay patterns, such as building local economies. This would make it so that, if we're talking about the USA, and we get a nice bit of attraction to California, shout out to Mexico, who currently owns California, if we create our own local economy there, then we wouldn't need to pay a bunch of freight to connect it overland all the way back to New York, right? And so it will incentivize this type of local economy creation in California so as to not have to pay as much freight. And that's very much what you saw during the gold rush is, they got a lot of stuff shipped from the East Coast initially, and then they developed a lot of their own local economies, and then it became kind of a bit of a hub in its own right. Similarly, with China specifically, there's enormous amounts of goods being produced, and to be fair, we did specify you don't have to pay freight on subsistence farms, but if you wanted to, you could introduce freight on subsistence farms. I don't think it's quite appropriate, but the idea is when you are really subsistence heavy, you will have a very, very strong dilution effect on freight, and you will not be that freight oriented, and so you will not have extremely high freight costs as long as no one foreign is meddling with you, and so because of this, you won't really suffer the negative effects of having really high demand for freight. Whereas if you are running an economy where, let's take a look back at Lancashire, where you have a very asymmetric kind of consumption and production profile. Look, they are producing an enormous amount of textile mills. They're going to have way more sell orders than the market, and they are going to be consuming all the consumer goods that are currently not present there in relatively high amounts. They're producing a bunch of extra coal. To be fair, they're also consuming they're not consuming the extra coal. The coal has to go to the market because they're not consuming it in the textile mills. They would be if they had steel. And so something like Lancashire would have a much stronger or much higher demand on the basis of this third variable, which is deviation from kind of the market prices. They would have a much higher multiplier. Although, as we'll kind of see, Great Britain will have a very strong advantage in the production of freight, such that you can kind of ignore this. And this is one of the benefits of having more freight, is you do not have to build as localized economies, and instead you can build up, kind of more around the capital and really push economies of scale. This entire system will create an environment where you are really strongly incentivized to push economies of scale in the capital and have a really strong capital. I don't know if this is necessarily good or bad, but specifically avoiding the third one means that you can push this sort of thing. Now, if you push really high, kind of furniture and textile mills in the capital and don't build it anywhere else, then the third variable, the deviation from the market price, is going to hurt more everywhere else. So you will punish places downstream at the effect of the capital. But if you're pushing these to export them, if you're doing what Great Britain did historically, then it's not going to be you that suffers the penalties from the freight. It's going to be foreign nations that suffer the penalty from the freight. And we'll kind of talk about this a little bit more. If you are exporting freight to them simultaneously, then they will be having to pay extra for their input goods, and they will be paying it out to your companies that are producing freight. And in that way, you are creating an extraction environment. You are creating the demand for the freight by exporting them the goods, and then they are in their own industries having to pay for that very same freight. The second way in which we will be creating buy orders for freight will be the wholesale replacement of convoys. Freight will just entirely replace convoys. If you wanted to keep the name Convoys, you could just port it over and have convoys replace freight in terms of the name, but I thought it would be confusing for me to qualify new convoys versus convoys, so we're just using freight. Now, this includes trade centers, which would use it as an input good. This is very important because this would make it so that places where you have trade centers are are going to be excellent places in terms of profitability to build sources of freight, whether that is, railroads or ports. But also, it is going to be very important to do that if you have low MAPI, which you will probably often have in places with really high-level trade centers. We'll come back to that. Secondarily, we have any types of overseas units or units that are moving anywhere, far away from the states that they are from, calculating on a per-state basis. These will increase the requirements for freight that will be paid, hopefully, ideally, locally at the barracks where they are, kind of being created, based on how far they have to go. The hope is that this will also positively affect other things about the military, such that having a logistical advantage by having a low freight cost, both locally and in the market, will give you significant advantages on the battlefield as well. The first one that comes to mind is supply. Now, I think that supply, they should have a distinct amount of goods, and if they are poorly supplied, the goods should go down, and once they reach critical thresholds, probably in some sort of logarithmic way, so they consume goods faster the more they have, and then slower and slower. As they trend towards having fewer and fewer goods, they should get very significant penalties that effectively just reduce them to being the irregular infantry, or the very worst of the PMs that is going to be the most basic here. If we could select an army, we could show it. It will downgrade effectively all armies to irregulars at zero supply. If you have a really high freight cost, you should resupply slower. Similarly, if you have a really low freight cost, you should resupply faster, because this represents that you have more excess freight in your economy, which means you can logistically organize a more effective fighting force if you have less freight, and this can be an axis upon which you can organize an advantage. I also think that the transportation PMs for military should scale with freight price. And so we see, in addition to migration, which we mentioned earlier, various aspects of the military should benefit from better logistics, and this should be something that you are able to pursue. So, for example, formation speed, maybe it scales up to 50% if you have minus 75% freight, and it provides absolutely nothing if you have plus 75% freight, which means you would have to, ahead of time, kind of organize an advantage in terms of logistics, but also this would make it a huge strain to fight wars that are far away, because, as we're discovering, freight is used in a ton of different things. If you significantly increase the freight costs because of your military, you're going to have some sort of bad time. The third way in which convoys are used is going to be port connections. Now, every state now is tracking its own connection, and the industries in those states are paying for the individual state's connection, but a lot of our port connections are connecting our subject to this. What I propose is kind of a two-tiered relationship, whereas vassal relations, what the overlord will do is locally, in the market capital, they will pay a freight cost, and let's say we have a subject, let's call it Canada, the Hudson Bay Company, and we are paying for the freight to connect them to the market. They will get their own market hub that they connect their states to, and they can be more efficient in that way, and they do not have to connect all of their states back to the home counties, and instead, whatever the differential in price is on that, we will pay for that freight locally in the home counties to connect them. The second relationship will be the colonial, more extractive relationship, such as the EIC. In that relationship, the UK will not pay the freight costs to connect the EIC to the market, and so instead the EIC will not have their own market hub, or if they have a market hub, they have a market hub for different reasons. We'll talk about market hubs more later, but instead they will have to pay a much higher freight cost locally on every good that they are consuming, and since the UK is producing most of the market's freight, this will end up, kind of filling the coffers of UK industries as they are forced to effectively pay for the shipment of their goods to the Great Britain's economy. In this way, we are this is a system by which, and we're going to come back to it over and over and over, the fact that other people are effectively paying for the freight that you're producing, and this stimulating your economy by exporting the freight, whether they're your subject or you're actually exporting the freight. I think that this is an axis that, while it is a bit strange, does in fact capture a bit of the exploitive and extractive nature of an economic system, and so I think that this is a good way of approaching it. And so the port connections for your subjects will be two-tiered in terms of who pays the freight, and also having subjects and you paying for them will create buy orders for freight in the market capital. I also think that there should maybe be baseline freight consumption in a couple of spots. One, your market capital should maybe both create freight and also buy freight locally, just to prevent weird sort of numbers and this type of thing, to regulate the price of the freight overall, something to this effect. But also, if there is a base freight cost that is extremely low, it will not negatively affect subsistence farms. The subsistence farms prices won't get super pushed out of the way, but it will help to keep the migration low in states, like Montana, to prevent them from getting very overpopulated initially. And this can be an additional freight cost that maybe makes some sense to prevent certain gameplay patterns that are maybe a little bit strange. While this is not quite a source of buy orders, I do think that this is an aspect of the mechanic that's really important, is I think that base MAPI should be very significantly nerfed, maybe by as much as 10%, and instead you should get additional MAPI based on the amount of freight that you have, based on the local price of freight as well as the market price of freight. So something like 7.5% if you're on minus 75% for the local price, and also minus 7.5% if you're at minus 75% for the market price. And in this way, this would make it so that if you are an absolute dominator in terms of your ability to produce the transportation of goods, then this makes it so that your ability for those goods to access the market is higher. I think that this is very intuitive, and also would very significantly reward countries for moving in the direction of producing more freight, or in reducing their freight costs so that their freight price can be more lucrative, so that all of their industries can be more profitable, and that this will have downstream effects. A secondary aspect of this is I think it's perhaps not the actual raw price of freight that should get used, but instead the price of freight as it relates to market buy and sell orders in terms of the market production of freight, excluding the amounts from trade routes. And what I mean by this is, here in the market, we have 4,000 buy orders for opium and 3.3 thousand sell orders. What we're going to have is we're going to have a slightly expensive market price. If instead we only considered our own consumption and excluded trade routes, we would actually have a cheaper price. What I think is that for the market effect of freight, we should exclude the trade routes. The idea being is this rewards countries for exporting freight and increases their ability to exploit other countries, and in turn also makes all of their industries far more profitable, because this would make MAPI approach 100%, because they're so good at bringing the goods to market, because a lot of their freight is exporting to other countries. So their ships are going to other countries. If that's the case, then it should be the case that they don't have a problem bringing the goods to the other countries, and in this way reward an exporting freight type of play pattern, rather than just using the raw price, using the modified price, where we are excluding trade routes from its consideration as it relates to thinking of the freight price, and having a cheap freight price give us much better MAPI. With this in effect, you would assume that the UK, a majority of the time, will actually have plus 75 or plus 7.5% MAPI from their market kind of effect. And then, in most of the places that are on the British Isles, where they have a ton of ports and are probably net producing significant amounts of freights, those will also have plus 7.5%. And so they will have excellent market access. And this additional market access will make it easier for them to be net exporters as well. So there's kind of cyclical and feedback loops that are created, by these effects. Because if you have better MAPI, you can produce a bit of a better situation. But simultaneously, as we export freight to China, that would also create more sell orders in their market. And so that would increase their MAPI. And by increasing their MAPI, it's easier for our trade routes to be profitable because they will be able to consume more of our delicious, delicious opium. Freight would also eliminate all zero-cost trade routes. You would just pay the freight locally at the state that is running the trade route, and you would still be able to ship overland, even if you had zero, ports. But you would have to produce the freight in one of the places that is not a port. I think it's maybe also worth noting that MAPI for freight is a bit of an interesting thing to think about. And if you wanted to have infrastructure be informed by freight, you could lower freight MAPI very significantly and create infrastructure penalties when you are running negative freight. And this would be one of the ways you could replace infrastructure. I haven't thought through that too much. I don't know if the model works, but that is some food for thought. I think if you were not doing that freight should maybe have 100% MAPI to make the exporting of it very, very fluid. This makes a lot of sense to me. If you were selling the transportation of goods, surely that would be the best or easiest thing to transport. And I think that there's already a little bit of, precedent for this type of thing in the game, in that it costs very little convoys to export any types of ships, because it's the ships themselves that are moving. And so I think it would make sense to have freight be the first variable MAPI item, where it is just always 100% MAPI. There's always, the access itself always has 100% access. And this would have the effect of allowing you to export it really, really aggressively to any country that has a more expensive freight cost than you, and reap the benefits of that exporting. As long as they weren't tariffing freight, which is maybe something that they would want to do. And I do think that freight opens up opportunities for trade wars to feel like more of a thing. Alright, so let's talk about sources of freight. For the most part, there are three main sources of freight, although there are maybe some tangential examples and maybe some unique buildings that you could use to create more freight, but they are the urban center, the railway, and also the port. And if you wanted to differentiate between different types of freight, you could have urban center and railway be producing either land or local freight, and you could have the port producing overseas freight. I currently think that a unified system of freight would probably be best, just dealing with the fact that you have a weird abstraction where you are exporting the freight from your railroads overseas sometimes. I don't think that this is necessarily problematic, but if you wanted a simulation that captures things better, you would need to differentiate between the two. Although, to be fair, you can think of transportation perhaps as land-based freight. An interesting idea is you could allow for the export of land-based freight, but only to people that are connected contiguously to a market capital or market hub of yours. With that said, urban centers should be a source of freight. And also, not only should they be a source of freight, the river bonuses, as they are captured now, I think the MAPI river market access price impact bonus should be removed entirely. It doesn't make sense that rivers are better at accessing the market than ports are, but instead, the river bonuses should be replaced with a modifier that positively affects not freight overall in a state, but urban center freight specifically. See, rivers and also major waterways were a really good way to kind of transport local goods. They wouldn't move far, obviously, but you could do stuff like moving down canals. You could have barges, things that are really low impact, really cheap, very small vessels and rafts and these types of things, and this would be ease the ability to transport goods across a local area. Since the urban centers are probably going to be the smallest source of freight overall, it would be interesting if you maybe got a positive modifier from rivers as it relates to urban centers. This would depend on the type of river or waterway. With countries like the Netherlands, where there is a ton of different canals and waterway areas, this was one of the major features of kind of Netherlands during the time period. Adam Smith wrote extensively about how the waterways of the Netherlands allowed for greater specialization because it allowed for the easier transportation of goods. Places that have really, really good waterway access should perhaps get obscenely big bonuses, specifically in their urban centers, such that this will make it so that their own local freight is really, really good, but they don't necessarily have such a big advantage that they could export this freight, and this will allow them to have really, really strong MAPI and give kinds of play patterns where a country like the Netherlands, as a result of having all these waterways, could play particularly tall as long as they choose not to export their freight, and in exchange they get a very strong MAPI bonus, or they could export their freight and throw around their weight a little bit more than a country could when they have a not as quite a robust modifier. And so I think this would be a good way of capturing this. Alongside this, I think canals should be constructible. You had enormous amounts of efforts in the United States to connect various waterways. I'm not as versed enough to be able to highlight all of them. I do believe that there's a river or two that, through a canal, has been connected to all the Great Lakes and things like this. And I think the ability to construct these is perhaps something that would be useful, and would also give you a sort of permanent bonus that you would maybe make it worth the government investing in such a production to the freight that is getting produced in the urban centers in order to give better MAPI, to give better local prices, so that industries can be more profitable there. If you overbuild hugely in one of these places, though, and really, really try and export a whole lot from a state that is getting this bonus, the urban center's overall production of freight should be small enough that it won't necessarily keep up with your ability to export out from a state, and then eventually you will increase the freight prices and suffer from the negative MAPI, but it will be much, much harder to do this. I think that overall volume of water, or kind of branching of these waterways is maybe in effect. Maybe a river like the Amazon River, wherever it is down here, should give way more of a percentage modifier. Netherlands again should give a really big modifier. The Yangtze River in China should probably give an enormous modifier. These riverways are vast and expansive, but I think that this would be a better approach to rivers, and also because ports still reign supreme, it really kind of removes this weird pattern where ports are providing not as much MAPI than like a river bonus is, and so like building on the Yangtze River in like Chongqing is like somehow better at accessing the market than just building on the coast down in like Beijing where there's no river bonus. This doesn't really make that much sense, but it would make sense that in terms of the local goods being produced there, that they could be transported more effectively. And so I think that this is a good way to alter the river bonus and tie in with the first production, which is at the urban center of freight. The second source of freight would be railways. Now, railways, if they just tag on freight as an additional sellable good, I think this would be a good thing because I think they're under profitable. This would boost the profitability. But beyond that, I think that railways should not only provide freight, but they should also reduce the cost of connecting to the capital in a way that increases with the number of levels they have, but increases in a way that is not linear, instead is rather logarithmic with some type of ceiling. Maybe the max amount of reduction you can get is minus 80% or minus 90%, but by decreasing the amount of buy orders that your industries that are connecting to the capital have, possibly even including the barracks, you can allow yourself to get a very low freight cost and still benefit from the MAPI, even if you aren't actually producing enormous quantities of freight. Instead, you're dealing with a reduction in cost. I think Prussia is a really good example of a country that didn't really have a very strong naval presence, but still had really strong infrastructure. One of the reasons why they had such a strong military was their ability to transport goods very, very effectively and troops very effectively, so that they could be, kind of on the spot. You see that represented in Frederick Krupp. So some of the military advantages we discussed might be able to be explained by Prussia having a very low cost on their freight, despite the fact that they don't really have a lot of ports, by the reducing cost effect that you would have by railways. Now, I think that these levels should have to connect to another place that has either greater or equal levels. So if we were wanting to connect Berlin to Posen, Berlin would need at least one railway, and then Posen would need a railway. If we wanted a level 2 connection, we would need 2 and 2. And if we were to connect Warsaw to Berlin, we would need to have Posen at level 2 as well. So it would have to be 2, 2, 2, much in the same way that you have kind of railways in Hoey, the way that this system operates. If you had Posen at level 1, then the benefit you would experience in Warsaw would be capped by having to travel through a level 1 railway in order to get to the market capital. This reduction in cost mechanic also would give you very significant benefit from actually accomplishing manifest destiny in the United States by rewarding you with reduced costs by stretching the railway out and connecting various other places. This would also hold true for our Siberia, where maybe building in Siberia is not very good until you get this railway access, which would provide both a reduced cost and a solid, kind of base amount, not as much as a port, but it would provide a base amount of freight in terms of the railways, such that you could profitably bring goods from this region, if it wasn't a lot, back into the market. And this would be a system, I think, that also leads to the same sort of effect we were talking about with the United States, where we have this sprawling effect, where we would radiate out from major population centers because we cannot just randomly build, in Wisconsin or whatever, without first kind of building the connecting areas, without building in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. We won't be able to get the full benefit of a railway unless we build in the places that are connected to it first. And this would give us a more of a play pattern that resembled, kind of westward migration in the United States as a result of how the railways are implemented here in terms of bonuses. In addition to, the migration effects, we would not be able to fully reduce, or you layer these on top of the migration effects, right? Where we would not be able to fully reduce the price of freight in areas without properly connecting them with a railway, which we would need to do contiguously, which would maybe be a project for the United States. If we wanted to populate the center of the Americas, we would maybe need to, at a loss, build railways in order to connect there so that we decrease the freight costs and allow populations to move there and fully benefit from extra migration from having lowered freight prices. Finally, we have the star of the show. What was really kind of the impetus for me really thinking about freight was actually this book here, which is Industry and Empire, which details Great Britain's kind of experience throughout the 1750s to modern day, but of course going through the era of industrialization, we have the port. And I think the port should be the basis for the production of the absolute positively most amount of freight, largely for the purposes of exporting that freight, for creating opportunities to exploit, colonized or underdeveloped nations. And that this should be really the crown jewel of, if you are trying to be really freight dominant, you want to build ports. Now, first of all, this would allow the system of them actually producing freight would allow for these buildings to be privatized. They could be for profit. They could be built by the construction queue. I think this is an improvement on the abstraction. But beyond that, I think that a system should be put in place where the ships used by the ports, just like the ships used by the Navy, should be discrete entities that are sinkable. And this means that if your convoys get raided, this is catastrophically bad for your production of freight and will have negative consequences down the road in a bunch of different ways. Like, for example, your market access is ruined for several years, whereas before you were enjoying a nice big advantage, and that the destruction of other countries' freight production in the form of their ports can be a military sort of endeavor you pursue. Let's say you're playing Great Britain, you see that France has built up a navy, you go to rumble with them with the primary intention of just crippling the amount of ports that they have, ruining all the industries, and keeping them down in that way. And if you do that, you don't even need to set foot in France. It allows you to fight Axis on a different type of war, because if freight becomes centrally important, attacking sources of freight becomes valuable. And so this creates a whole nother environment of situations. Also, if exporting freight creates unique diplomatic opportunities, which we will get to later, then producing a bunch of freight will be very useful. Now, I think that this also should, just like the urban center and the railway, where they have modifiers being applied to them, I think there should be a modifier for how much value you get out of your ports, and I think it should be the ratio of your naval power projection to your freight, or if you're being specific about differentiating between land and naval freight, your naval freight. And so this means if we have a larger navy power projection, we will get some sort of multiplicative modifier to the output. That's not the throughput, that's the output of freight in our nation by being able to control shipping lanes effectively, being able to muscle out other countries, not having to worry about privateers, although I think that was like 150 years prior to this, that was more of an issue. Naval power projection should be made useful in this way, such that also sinking other countries' navies will allow you to dominate trade. One of the reasons why Great Britain dominated during the century was not because they were better at industrialization, but because they were better at shoving goods down other people's throats and also establishing monopolies and control over other countries that they were exploiting, and not letting other countries exploit them. Great Britain got there first, and they got there first on the backs of their maritime presence and navy, which isn't properly reflected in game. But if navy has a multiplicative effect with the value of your ports, such that if you have a lot of ports and you want to push this type of thing, then things change. This also means that your port connections and your freight costs, when they have to go through sea nodes, if you get a multiplicative bonus on your ports from Navy, this means that it effectively gets cheaper to transport goods through sea nodes. So it becomes cheaper for you to have a massive far-flung empire if you are getting some sort of multiplicative modifier here. And I think that this is definitely, comports with the UK, Great Britain. I do make that mistake a lot. This comports with like the historical situation with Great Britain, and also allows them to differentiate and have a really big advantage, in terms of our initial example of Russia getting the enormous benefit of not having convoys and, Great Britain getting screwed here. If we see like the starting position in terms of how many ports Great Britain has and also what type of navy they have, Great Britain will have an absolutely massive multiplier towards its already massive amounts of ports, and in this way they will have an enormous amount of freight, and they will be able to throw their weight around, and they will be able to engage in military affairs overseas more. I think that it should probably cost a lot more freight to send troops overseas, and the degree to which it disrupts your economy will be very, very small for Great Britain, and that the port is kind of the central jewel in terms of this. I don't think we mentioned it as much with the sources, but with putting freight costs on every single building, we are slowing down the economy. But at the same time, we have a bunch of buildings that we previously didn't have outputs for, in terms of the urban centers, the ports, and the railways. By giving them all freight now, we move the value of the economy just to something else, and it isn't necessarily slowing down the economy, but I do think that the entire system would probably necessitate perhaps a readjustment of PMs. Specifically, I think heavy industry PMs should be a little bit better, but this is just to incentivize the player for pushing them. I think they should be better for promoting kind of the exploitative nature, and this should be done alongside freight. But I suppose that's kind of a bit of a discussion for later. I also think that the natural harbors bonus should not apply to shipyards and military shipyards, and should instead apply to ports. And this would allow really strong economic stimulus in any sort of area that has a natural shipyards bonus, which I think is appropriate. I also think that the shipyards and military shipyards, you generally don't build a lot of these, and the value of these natural harbors isn't properly reflected in terms of the shipyards. At the same time, those shipyards and military shipyards are likely to crop up where you have a bunch of ports, as well as navies anyways, and so you'll still be getting them in the same spots. I think if you do this, you maybe have to rethink how strong some of these bonuses are, but maybe it's appropriate to give the UK a whole bunch of these natural harbor bonuses, which will allow them to really push the freight quite strongly. I'm uncertain that ports should have a cap in this sort of context. I don't know if that's really appropriate, but maybe it still is. Maybe you need it there for performance reasons. But one of the ways I definitely think it should be relooked is I'm uncertain that every single state in all of Scandinavia should have one of these bonuses. But I guess, wait, has that always had electricity? Shout out to them. That's insane. I didn't even realize. But I think that this bonus is really strong, so maybe it should be tamed down if it were actually applying to freight, which is becoming, an entire mechanism by which a lot of things are really dependent or hinged on. Getting a 5% or 15% throughput bonus on that is really strong, but maybe the UK should be receiving this type of bonus here. So we have referred to this idea of market hubs multiple times, and I think that it is a bit of an important one, but there's an underlying question you have to ask yourself from a game development perspective, and I don't know what the answer to this question is, and so this makes it a little bit difficult to unpack, but I do think this is an idea worth exploring, which is that having multiple market capitals within a single market. And so, for example, us playing as Portugal, maybe eventually we get a market hub in Macau. Maybe this is something that happens, and what a market hub will in theory do is it will allow any of your states to instead connect to Macau if Macau is closer than your market capital. And the underlying question is how much do we want this to be a game about globalization, and how much do we want this game to be about more localized economies? Do we want to have globalized economies where connecting to the market capital is an absolute must, or do we want economies that are kind of going to branch out from particular spaces, and maybe we want to have sort of a mixed bag, which I think is the case. In the case of the United States, for example, I think it would be reasonable if, both New York and California became a market capital under certain conditions, and you didn't have to connect all the way back to New York, but you could instead connect back to California. And this is the idea behind having market capitals, but also I think that there is this idea of shared sort of value. The best example of shared value would be present in the Suez and Panama Canal, which I think should be reworked around the freight system. And the idea is we would need a certain amount of freight to connect, for example, a state like Bombay to the market capital of the UK here in the home counties. And that amount of freight would be decreased if we had the Suez Canal. What I think should be the case is the owner of the canal, and perhaps at the site of the canal itself, there should be a bit of economic activity. What should happen is Bombay should calculate twice how much it needs to pay, and perhaps this is prohibitive from a performance perspective, how much it needs to pay in freight to connect to the home counties. One where it travels through the Sinai Canal or the Suez Canal, and one where it travels around the Horn of Africa. If you do this, you would then calculate the difference between these two, and whatever the difference between these two is, half is just a value that gets, passed on to Bombay. All the industries in Bombay, they don't need to pay as much freight in terms of their input, and the other half, Bombay still pays but they pay it directly to the owner of the canal, or the company that owns the canal, or the building of the canal, whatever abstraction is appropriate. And in this way, there is a splitting of value in terms of the amount of freight saved by going through the canal, making canals not only more valuable, but not very valuable early on, but scale up in value tremendously, which was the case during the time period. Now, I bring this up a little bit out of order because that is kind of related more to diplomatic relations and trade relations, because with regards to having a market hub, I think that it should be the case that you should allow other countries to sometimes connect to your market hub. Other countries could maybe connect to, London if it's closer, or let's say the UK ends up establishing some sort of market hub in their market in Bengal. Okay, and then let's say hypothetically, in West Bengal, let's say hypothetically that, France decides to take Vietnam. The truth hurts. France could then have a sort of diplomatic relationship where they get to connect to the UK's market hubs. If that were the instance, France could then connect their market, what they control of Vietnam, instead to Bengal and pay less in freight. What would happen is the value would then get split in some way between France, all the industries in Vietnam, saving money and not needing to pay as much freight. This would be one source of savings. Also, decreasing the freight consumption would decrease the freight price, which would give positive benefits like increased MAPI, these types of things. But half the value you're still paying for in terms of what would have gotten saved relative to traveling all the way around the Horn of Africa and back to France. Half this value gets saved, and then the other half would go to Great Britain in some sort of way. I'm not really sure where the abstraction should be. Maybe it should just be production of freight in West Bengal here, or production of freight in the Suez Canal. Maybe the Suez Canal should just produce an obscene amount of freight in that half the freight that would have been saved, it just produces itself instead, this sort of thing. But I like this idea of passing on value and connecting to market hubs, and also using market hubs as a tool for both diplomatic and trade dominance, because if the France is reliant on the freight and market hubs of the UK in order to keep its colony in Vietnam profitable, then this will give the UK leverage against France, even if the UK isn't dumping freight into France's market and exploiting them in that way. They can still have this relationship. Also, it's a bit of a win-win, and it creates value, and it is this interesting thing that would be kind of one of the incentives beyond the obvious incentive for creating or having market hubs in their entirety. Notably, if the UK were to gain free sell orders of freight, this would effectively entrench their dominance, as a provider of freight throughout the world, which definitely was their position in the late 1800s when they stopped really being an industrial power at all. They provided freight and finance. But this raises the larger sort of kind of question of, if we want these market hubs, which isn't necessarily evident, if we want market hubs, how should they be created? Under what circumstances should they be created? These types of things. And I think that you could do a lot of different ways of doing this. I don't really have an answer that I think feels really good or is necessarily a really good emergent gameplay pattern. The one that would give the player the most agency is just being able to construct one, but I think that that's a little bit artificial. You could maybe construct one if you filled certain requirements. You could maybe put it as an edict, although I think I would want something a lot more permanent than an edict. You could maybe have a permanent edict, which it locks down your authority for a really long period of time, or you could create an edict to support a market capital, the creation of one. I think that probably the best system would be doing it based off of freight, which is that the countries that are, or the states rather, that are having the greatest number of either buy orders or sell orders or combined buy and sell orders of freight, the top 10 states, let's say, get market hubs. or if not the top 10 states, perhaps something a little bit more like the top 10 states that are at least 5 nodes away from a market capital, to prevent the UK from just having 5, market hubs in the middle of kind of its nation, or 5, at least 5 away from another market hub, and maybe capitals can be market hubs, and so maybe the home counties is a market hub, which makes all of the other provinces in the British Isles ineligible. Something like this. Notably, if you did not have the exploitation or the exploitative measure on your subjects, perhaps the UK's subjects that aren't having to ship all the freight or all the goods directly back to the home counties, maybe their market capitals, like Canada's market capital, once it fully forms, since it's not a market capital writ large, maybe this would be a place where a hub would be likely to be produced. And I think that you could do a lot of things with hubs beyond just kind of the splitting of value between France and Great Britain. Let's say Great Britain takes Hong Kong, and then Hong Kong, because there's so much trade volume with China, will have an enormous amount of buy orders of freight, which will make producing freight there very, very profitable, and so the UK likely produces a lot of freight there. This will make treaty ports a lot more valuable, but this treaty port might become a market hub to which other things can connect. And if that's the case, there could be the potential for a bit of, and we're kind of trending into diplomacy a little bit here, a bit of a forcing another country to use your market hubs. So let's say we forced the Qing to use our market hub, and let's pretend Macau is Hong Kong. It's pretty close. If we had this treaty port, right, and we're forcing China to connect all of its southern states, effectively speaking, to our hub instead of, their market capital, and then we are splitting the value in terms of freight saved, in this way, China is sort of winning or benefiting, but we are also slurping up value out of their economy because some of the freight that they are paying for is effectively going to us, and this creates a mean by which we can exploit. Further than that, we talked about a 50-50 win-win type of situation between Great Britain and France, where France was shipping its stuff to West Bengal, and in doing so, they saved on freight and they passed the value on to the UK. It doesn't necessarily have to be 50-50. What we could instead have is varying tiers of relationship wherein value is going to be split in a way that is not 50-50. But at this point, I think we're getting a little bit into diplomacy. So just to emphasize a little bit here, beyond just connecting to, effectively the market capital, it reduces, all the costs in all the states around it. So if we were to make California somehow, as the USA, a market hub, this would allow us to have this eastward expansion effect. And I think that this is worth highlighting. And this is kind of, the ability to do this is kind of something that is really the crux of one of my major interests in this, because it doesn't always make sense to only radiate out from the capital, and I think that some of these effects should be applying to other places. Beyond that, though, I think that a bonus could be applied to market hubs in addition to the really positive effects that are already being applied, one of which being that since they don't have to connect to themselves, they will necessarily have very, very low freight costs, although it won't necessarily be zero. Like, for example, in Macau, they won't have to spend any freight in any of their, dye plantations or logging camps or any of this because they're connected to themselves, but they will still have all the freight costs of the trade centers. And maybe a certain level trade center is what creates a market hub, something like this as well. But you could layer other bonuses on top. I'm not really sure what's appropriate. This is maybe a bit of this is at the periphery of concern, but I think that this is something you could definitely do and give players something that they would want to play towards. I suppose a bit of a final kind of idea is that you could make the creation of market hubs contingent on something in the power block, and you could make it so that a power block principle allows you to create a singular market hub. This is maybe a bit of an interesting kind of interaction that would allow you as USA, to plop one down in California, it would allow you to create multiple market hubs, this type of thing. Perhaps some of the market hub relations are locked behind, some of the principal groups, and so throwing your weight around in this sort of way requires you be a block leader, or be a member of a block that has a leader that has this principle, and that this would be maybe an area of ingress for the market hubs. I think that even if you were going to introduce this entire system, though, market hubs can just come later. It's not an essential element to the system. It's just a bit of a thought regarding, kind of some of the ideas in here, and you could certainly implement it and then have DLC for hubs later. So in the last section, we talked about how the value from the Suez Canal, it should reduce the total amount of freight you have to spend in buildings, and this value saved, this reduction in the amount of freight required, should sort of be split 50-50 between two countries, the country that owns the Suez Canal and also the country that is shipping the goods. However, capitalism doesn't always have a 50-50 split. In fact, sometimes there's leverage. And in order to talk about leverage, we're going to have a bit of story time. And I know what you're thinking. General, it's not the story time. I want to hear more about freight. Well, too bad, because we are going to be talking about Marcus Licinius Crassus, who in some ways was the first capitalist. He was the richest man alive during his time period, and he invented the first fire brigade, which I think is the absolute best kind of story for understanding leverage. See, the way that this fire brigade operated is they would roll up to your house as it was on fire. Then they would offer it to buy the house for, let's say, 5 cents on the dollar, and you were kind of given two choices. You could either let your house burn down and lose all of your house, or you could sell your house for 5 cents on the dollar. And what we see here is an asymmetric split. That's not a 50-50 split. 50-50 would be buying your house for half of it, for 50% on the dollar, 50 cents on the dollar rather, but they would buy your house on 5 cents on the dollar, and then they would rent it back to you and collect rents from you. And that's one of the ways Crassus got so rich. We're taking that kind of idea here into Victoria 3, because if we had, instead of a 50-50 split, we had a 95-5 split doing our best Crassus impression, we would be able to extract more value. While it's still technically a win-win, it's a way bigger win for the exploitating party. And I think that you should create these types of opportunities and relations as a result of freight interactions. Specifically, if you are controlling almost all the movement of resources for another country's market, then you have enormous leverage over them, and you should be able to control and extract value from them in this way. And so, for example, if Egypt owns the Suez Canal, but you have a ton of leverage over Egypt, then they should only be able to collect 5% from you. And the idea I think I have, or the idea that Ken came up with here in regards to how that would work, is there would be an equilibrium towards which it would trend, where if the number of sell orders in the market of freight from your country exceeds the number of sell orders they have from their own production, that should be where the top end equilibrium is, and maybe at that point you have 90% of the value split or 95% of the value split, and you get almost everything. And so by exporting freight to another country, you allow yourself to get a better and better type of situation whenever there is a sort of value split occurring, which there would be doing if they were connecting to market hubs, or if they're traveling through the Panama or Suez Canal. And hopefully there would be other kinds of relationships that would allow for these asymmetric splits where you would be exploiting the other country, but you would still both be winning. But you'd be, Crassus, my house almost burnt down, so I sold it for 5 cents and now I'm renting it type of winning. Now, for this freight asymmetry, one of the main values of it that I had kind of envisioned was this idea of diplomatic pressure, that you could force other countries to, engage in other pacts at the threat of destroying their economy with trade repercussions had they not. And I think that if you pull the rug out from under them, this should be a mechanic that you can do, and it should perhaps hurt their economy or give them a bit of, economic whiplash when you withdraw all the convoys, or sorry, not the convoys, the freight from a country. They should get some sort of negative MAPI modifier that scales with the size of this convoys. And this can be a way that you can punish countries, in order to have a sort of mechanism by which you can pressure them. And I think the way the pressure should be resolved is, let's say hypothetically, we're playing the UK and we want to ban slavery in Brazil because that's part of the flavor. That is something we want to do. What we could do is perhaps export a bunch of freight. Now we dominate the shipping and distribution of goods in their country, and then we threaten to pull that out from under them if they don't ban slavery. If they choose to ban slavery, great, they don't have to suffer the economic negative effects, and what instead would happen is in their market capital, they would perhaps gain amount of freight production. We would have a similar cost of freight production in the UK, and this would reflect the UK giving some sort of concessions or throwing some sort of bones to Brazil as a result of Brazil backing down. But at the same time, this pressure was created by the asymmetry in the economic relation to begin with, and that this could be, fun, and by fun I mean capitalist and exploitation, colonialization, sort of system for kind of incentivizing freight beyond just the sale of a good, but the creation of certain exploitative economic relationships. Beyond that, I had also envisioned that if you have a really strong, freight kind of balance with another country, you should get a reduction in costs, a reduction in infamy costs against them. Now, I don't know if this should apply to every sort of play, but it should certainly apply to, opening their economic sphere more and more, enforcing any type of economic rights on them, these types of things, forcing them to privatize all the buildings in their country, because you already have such a deep economic relationship with them in regards to how their market is handled that you can, gain all this stuff on the cheap. And I thought that would be another sort of mechanism that could be used to kind of reflect the amount of leverage that you are getting, increasing more and more, and allowing you to, more take advantage of other countries as a result of this sort of asymmetry in the transport of resources, because you can always go somewhere else, but if they are reliant on you for the transportation of all their goods, they can't go anywhere else, and there's an asymmetry. Beyond that, there is a sort of extractive economic loop that can be created so as to encourage the use of freight, the spending of freight, and the export of freight. Now, this is, perhaps the modifier needs to be something other than just a ratio. Perhaps it needs to exceed the total sell orders by a certain amount and also have a ratio, something to this effect. But as we export goods to the Congolese market, like if we export clothing or tools or this types of stuff, what it will do, remember going back to how freight costs are created, if there's a big asymmetry in terms of the local prices and also the market price, what will happen is that this will push up freight costs. When we export goods to the market, we export only to the market, not to the local position of Congo. Even though it's a one-state source, we will be changing the prices of the market. And as we move the price of the market, we increase their dependence on freight. And by increasing their dependence on freight, what will happen is that this will increase the freight inputs of all of their industries. As the price of the industry comes up, or the inefficiency of the industry is created, because now it has a freight cost, this will increase the demand from freight and allow us to export more freight alongside our other goods. So it works in a reinforcing pattern, because as we export more other goods, we create more demand for freight, and they will consume more freight, so we can export more freight. As we export more freight, we increase their MAPI if we can pull freight costs down, which is to say, if we have really, really low freight, we can pull their freight costs down quite a bit. If we have medium freight, we can only pull it down towards our own freight. So having really, really low freight in our market will allow us to exploit better. But as we export freight to them, we increase their MAPI, which is going to increase their consumption of our goods and allow them to consume goods better from our market, which is going to allow us to further send them more more goods, and we can further entrench ourselves in a way that has a feedback loop, as far as I can tell, where it allows us to sink our hooks in deeper and deeper and deeper into their economy. And while we are doing this, we are creating the demand for freight, then we are supplying it, but all of their industries are still consuming freight. They are still going to be using freight as an input, but they're not producing the freight themselves, so they are not benefiting from the price being increased, giving them greater efficiency in their own industries. Instead, what is being benefited is all of our ports back in the UK here. This is pushing up the price of freight so that we can sell the freight at a larger price, and in this way, we are extracting a value from every single one of buildings in their economy because they are using an input good that we are supplying, and at the same time we are increasing the profitability of all of the industries in our economy without increasing our own freight costs very much. We're just increasing them a little bit, but we are instead pushing up, well, we are increasing them by however amount it is, but it is not being paid by us, right? We are only paying for some of the freight that is being consumed, the freight that is being consumed in our own market, which we're trying to push down with the combination of railroads and other things. But the freight that is being consumed overseas, that's like free butter, baby, to push up the price of freight in our economy without pushing up local freight costs as much as it's pushing up the market price. And in doing this, we can effectively siphon off value. At the same time that this entire relationship is occurring, what is going to happen is this is going to encourage them to build more resource inputs, because as freight costs increase, manufacturing industries get more and more expensive, because recall kind of the second feature is the manufacturing industries, the heavier the goods, the more freight costs will negatively affect the place. And so this makes it so they don't want to create manufactured goods, and instead they export resources, or they create resources because they will have to pay smaller and smaller amounts on the resources or stuff like grain in terms of freight costs. So these will be the more profitable opportunities for them. As they focus on resources, we can import those resources and further exacerbate the fact the fact that they have to specialize in resources and can't build manufactories makes their economy polarized. It's not a balanced economy, and this polarization invites further exploitation because we siphon off the resources, which is the emergent gameplay pattern we are trying to create here with the system of freight, because that's the historic pattern of exploitation, siphoning off the resources and sending manufactured goods. And then we can send manufactured goods, and the creation of this increasing polarization increases freight demand, and the higher and higher freight demand, we are able to siphon off value by being the one who is supplying the freight, and we make their economy less and less profitable while siphoning off inputs for us to allow us to focus and specialize even more on manufacturing and making our economy more profitable by making our own freight more profitable, in addition to making all of our industries more profitable, because we're also exporting to increase buy orders to increase prices, which makes industries overall more profitable. All of these systems create an exploitative feedback loop that's currently not really present in the game, because the game pushes you towards having generalized economies. The hope is that this freight system would push you towards having economies that are more manufacturing oriented for the industrialized nations that are able to push freight, and push all the colonized nations, or the nations subject to colonial influence, push them in the direction of resource industries. While there is not a mechanism for corruption in game currently, if there were one, it ought to push more corruption onto the country that is exploited in this way, as there is a lot of evidence to suggest that countries that tend to be more resource rich in terms of their economies relative to manufacturing or services will tend to achieve more corruption. And so it's like you're offering out, with one hand, a poison, which is the nature of this like trade relationship and pushing pushing a bunch of freight down the throats of these colonized countries, you are offering both the poison and the solution to the poison simultaneously, and you are creating a feedback loop that leaves them unable to care for themselves and unable to get their own manufacturing and industrialization off the ground, which is very much the entire point. And this emergent gameplay pattern is created by the, small little details in terms of how freight costs are created, layered on top of the fact that freight prices and relative freight prices are going to influence a whole bunch of things, which allow us to create this sort of exploitative relationship that's really not currently present in game as it relates to just trading with another country, other than encouraging them to build a little bit more of a certain industry that's not as profitable, which is not a very robust effect that properly, simulates what colonization was. I thought this fit a little bit better here than where we were talking about buy orders for freight, but I also think that the cost of maintaining a diplomatic interest should be freight, and this should perhaps increase the farther it is away from your capital or market capital, and it should also, be multiplied by various technologies, making it easier. For example, the creation of radios, and the telephone should decrease the freight cost here, but there should also be a tiered system, perhaps, on the way you declare your interests, that makes it cost more freight if you want to invest more freight into a more nuanced type of interest pattern, and that this should be one of the ways in which you leverage having a freight advantage. I think that this is kind of a good simulation that's a little bit better than just, looking at Navy power projection. Instead, what the government is doing is it is investing in the costs that it takes to send a bunch of diplomats around, a bunch of representatives around, and the cost of this would be freight, not the size of their navy, but this would strongly correlate with navy size as well. I do think that this would be a bit of an improvement. By making it cost freight, and perhaps an increasing amount of freight per marginal interest. So the first interest is free, the second one's 100, the third one's 200, 300, 400, etc., or perhaps increasing in an exponential way. You make it so that there is a trade-off to be had and a decision point about whether you want to establish more interests or to use the resources you have to dominate the current interests you have more. I think that this is a bit of an interesting kind of way of looking at it, but also it ties into the fact that, projecting power in terms of your military as well is going to cost you freight. And it's no longer just like this convoy situation where it's really not that big a deal that you're using convoys on, supply routes and this type of thing. It's just going to decrease your trade routes. The trade routes aren't that valuable anyways. It doesn't really make too big a difference because you have a bunch of overland trade routes for free. Now instead, if you have to project a lot of power overseas, this will negatively affect all the previous things that we've talked about as it relates to benefits you are getting from having a reduced freight cost, because you will inject a whole bunch of buy orders of freight into the market and dramatically increase the price. At the same time, this is also going to make it so that countries, like Great Britain, that have enormous amounts of freight being produced in their market, and is being produced and consumed both by private industries, but these countries will be much, much better at projecting their power out. Whereas someone like Prussia, who's maintaining perhaps a low freight price through the creation of a bunch of railways, and they're just keeping the price of their freight really, really low, by having localized economies, lots of railroads, this type of stuff, they don't actually have a lot of freight in their market. And so, as a result of this, they cannot project their power out very far, and doing something like invading China is very, very prohibitive to them, whereas it would not be the case with Great Britain, it would just be a much smaller dent in your kind of state of affairs. And in this way, you can kind of think of there as being a couple different ways of approaching freight. Great Britain enormous advantage in the production of freight. They build a ton of ports. They project power out. They exploit the sun never sets on their empire, etc., etc. Prussia, or someone like the USA, perhaps a bit more inward focused, more concerned with reducing freight costs internally, and by reducing freight costs internally, benefit from migration, connect a bunch of stuff, have better markets, this type of stuff, but not necessarily investing in as much in ports, and can't necessarily project their power out as far as someone like Great Britain can, even if they had a very similar price in terms of their freight costs, because Great Britain just has a much, much larger overall buy and sell orders in their market of freight, and this would be further increased, if there are a whole bunch of buy orders coming from exploited countries, that encourage more ports to be created. This further allows your power projection to happen, and it further, increases the snowball. At the later the later portion of the 19th century, Great Britain was actually really bad at industrialization, but they were such a hegemon when it came to the production of freight that they were able to prop up their entire nation on the back of the fact that they could produce freight very, very, very effectively. There's also a little bit of interplay in regards to if you are playing a country and you want to maintain your own sort of autonomy, projecting your power out is a bit of a risk. If we're playing Prussia and we have a freight cost in our market of, minus 20%, and Great Britain is minus 30%, if we try and project our power outward towards the Congo, let's say, and in doing so, increase our freight price to minus 10%, because the Congo's freight price plus 30%, when we decrease their freight price as Prussia as a means of exploiting them, we are going to increase our own freight price. We leave ourselves open to being exploited by Great Britain because they can try and export freight to us and sink a kind of their claws in and force us to do stuff like open our markets and accept their manufactured goods, which we, again, don't want to do because we want to get our own industrialization off the ground. This system would tie in with one where industrialization helps further industrialization rather than technology just allowing you to swap up to better PMs. This is beyond the scope of this video, but in an environment where you are wanting to industrialize yourself instead of accepting industrial goods from someone else, giving yourself this sort of defense from this exploitation by choosing not to project in the Congo might be something that Prussia would be interested in doing and instead be more inward oriented. The US definitely comes to mind in this regard, perhaps just wanting to sit home and develop rather than necessarily project their power outward. Another way countries could try and fight off, the overwhelming presence of Great Britain's freight advantage is to have a sort of trade war, which currently in game isn't something you really ever do or think about, but if you're wanting to actively prevent them from exporting industrial goods to you, preventing you from industrialize, suddenly various means of protectionism become a lot more popular. You can embargo Great Britain. You can also put tariffs specifically on freight as you see it, and tariff the freight in order to prevent it from being dumped into your economy at too high a price. This, of course, negatively affects your industries demanding freight, but prevents them from forcing more goods down your throat than you would like. Also, to this end, this is kind of comports with the way things were historically, where Great Britain became incredibly free trade oriented, as time went on, and they had an enormous kind of advantage, or they benefited from the free trade being free, because it wasn't really free. There was asymmetries in terms of pressure, such that the beneficiary of free trade was more often than not Great Britain, and a lot of other countries that were slower to industrialize or were not first on the scenes in regards to industrialization put in protectionism, specifically targeting stuff like iron, coal, and steel, to allow themselves to industrialize. And so this, wanting not all trade to be good type of gameplay pattern would breathe some life into the trade policy laws. In addition to, there's probably a whole bunch of other systems you could create around this idea of having a trade war for this mechanic, because I think this mechanic introduces, currently in the game, there's not really situations where you're like, really, I want to stop this trade route. And this would be the case if we implemented the system with freight and all of its cascading effect, because the help, it starts to hurt. The little tease of the Crassus is 5% poison. And so we would want to protect ourselves, industrialize ourselves, and so perhaps we institute protectionism, we close up some of the trade with Great Britain, these types of things, but on the diplomatic, on the world stage, there should perhaps be a world kind of diplomacy stage mechanic that makes it so that embargoing Great Britain is maybe hard, maybe Great Britain can pressure you in other sorts of ways because they are so dominant in the world's both production and consumption of freight, and these asymmetries maybe gives them new opportunities and stuff like this. This is kind of reaching the edges of the way I've thought about stuff, because currently there doesn't exist like any sort of trade war mechanic, so it's hard to imagine new ways of and tools of approaching a trade war. But I definitely think that this would create such an environment, especially in the context of multiplayer, where other players could recognize, when they are properly getting screwed over by the dumping of freight and goods into their market, forcing them to become highly dependent on another nation. And so they would want to take, steps to defend against this, and there should be sorts of moves and counter moves one could make towards that end of having, a little bit of a trade war, which would help to enrich the diplomatic kind of situation writ large, because this sort of trade war should be the ways in the first kind of half of this century that the great powers are fighting as they are trying to avoid open war, and then eventually stuff erupts into a much more open type of conflict. I also think that this system would better enable arbitrage, especially if acquiring a really, really large portion of a market's sell orders of freight gave you increased trade route competitiveness in their market. And in this way, if you could acquire a bunch of trade route competitiveness in a bunch of different markets while pumping up their MAPI to points where they can tolerate a lot of trade, it's possible that you can, import from one economy just to export to another economy. And in doing so, you can actually balance, if you're the UK, you can balance, your market sell and buy orders a little bit better than you would otherwise normally be able to by doing stuff like importing dyes from, all over the place, kind of in the more exploitative world, getting tea from over here, and then exporting and dumping it to something like the Prussian market, where these things will be very expensive. And while it is not going to push up their demand for freight as much as dumping industrial goods, you will be able to kind of shunt off a lot of your differential in terms of buy orders and sell orders from the market, because we know that you will get a much higher freight cost if there's a lot more sell orders of dyes than there are, or if there's a lot more buy orders of dyes in the locally than there is relative to the market. And what you can do is you can increase the number of buy orders of dyes in the market by exporting it, and so this might create a situation where arbitrage is profitable, that is buying from another country just to sell it back to a different one. I'm not entirely sure, but I certainly think it's more promising a prospect for arbitrage than the current system as it stands now, where trading is just really not very productive at all. Instead, this creates a much bigger horizon for trade. And I think that's going to be the video. I don't think I can really try and summarize this. A lot of it is just potential systems and this type of thing, which is just something that's difficult to summarize. And it's also difficult to offer a sort of, very, very simplified version of this. I suppose the most simple version is that you will pay the cost to transport goods based on the distance it is from your market capital, and this will be influenced by the weights of the goods, as well as how unbalanced the local economies are will increase the freight costs, and freight is now going to be a sellable good, and selling it, specifically exporting it, is going to be lucrative, not just because you will make more money, but also because it will give you improved sorts of modifiers and a variety of different ways. And also reducing and thinking about freight cost is probably going to be important because it will do stuff like increase MAPI, which will have a cascade of other positive effects. And the sources of this freight are going to vary, but they are going to be urban centers, which are going to be modified by rivers and canals, allowing some countries like the Netherlands to have a pretty robust situation as it relates to freight by virtue of having a lot of waterways. They will also be given by railways, which will allow, you know, the USA to sort of ingress into the interior states, whereas otherwise they would have to have both economic and migration activities sort of radiate outwards from their market centers. Railroads will provide them with an opportunity to really manifest destiny, which will make projects for railways a lot more attractive towards countries, in addition to making them more profitable. And finally, the main source of freight would be in the ports, or the largest source of freight, which would be modified further by the size of your navy, really giving extreme advantage to Great Britain in this regard, allowing for really heavy-handed exploitation as the time period kind of demanded, where they weren't even that technologically great. It was really the advantage in terms of freight and finance not being something we covered, that allowed Great Britain to be very powerful. And that's kind of the shortest bit of a summary I can give here. I think I really would love this system to be implemented. It seems like there's a lot of texture there. I think that it's perhaps easy enough on the performance to be implemented, where you are not calculating on a good by good basis, but you're calculating on a per state basis. It still should be more performance intensive than the current system. If you guys like this video, please feel free to do the like, comment, subscribe, YouTube algorithm stuff, hit the notification bell, this sort of thing. This video took quite a long time to make, beyond just kind of thinking through the ideas, creating a whole bunch of notes, recording a whole bunch of this. It's a rather long video and this type of thing, and it is quite unlike other videos I've done because it's a bit of a propositional type of thing. So if you guys, I would really appreciate feedback on as to whether or not you guys would like more videos of this kind, because, or just, yeah, I mean, I would really appreciate feedback in this regard. If people really enjoy it, I could do more of these. I actually enjoyed making it, probably more than I enjoy playing. I'm not entirely sure, but it would be nice to know if this is beyond just whatever numerical feedback I get from people watching. I think a lot of people will not watch nearly 2 hours in, so there will be some survivorship bias for you guys, the ones who've responded, but feedback would be appreciated. Also, if you have watched this video in one shot, probably get up and take a walk. You've been sitting a while. This sort of thing. Maybe take a break from YouTube, you know, take a breath, get up, get a glass of water. Shout out to the jugs. You know, we got the water jug and we got the piss jug. We're all set, except we take walks. We don't use the piss jug. Anyways, other than that, yeah, have a good day. Bye-bye now.